Hi everyone, welcome to this week's video, and today we're going to carry on looking at the Gospel. Last week we had that great video from John where he shared about the Gospels and the Gospel being this bigger picture of God's whole story, starting way back at the start of Genesis and even still going and being written today. And today's video we're going to specifically look at how to share the gospel. Now, this may sound like a really challenging question, but I promise you by the end of this video you'll have a better understanding of how to share it and better way to communicate what the gospel actually is with the people around you. Because I know for myself, as obviously a church worker, I often get asked, why am I a church? Like, why do I go to church? Why do I believe in God? And I know growing up in school, before I even thought about working for the church, I also got asked those questions. So the chances are you've probably been asked these questions. And through today's video, we're going to go through a few different ideas of how to answer that question of why do you even go to church? Why do you care about Jesus? And before we get into that, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page here and understand what the Gospels actually say Jesus is, or who they say he actually is. So if you haven't ever done it before, what I want you to do, I'm not obviously going to read it all now, but I want you to go away, pick a gospel, so Matthew, Mark, Luke or John, and read it. You just need to pick one. You can read all four if you really want, but just pick one and read it from start to finish. And I want you to do this because you can't share the gospel, you can't share about God without actually knowing who Jesus is. Yes, you may have grown up in Sunday school or youth group or even just at school hearing snippets of this Jesus guy, and you may be able to reel off some stories or parables or whatever relating to him. But if you read the whole of the gospel and think about what it actually says about Jesus, think about what you know about Jesus, you'll start to develop an actual understanding of who Jesus is as a person rather than just as a character in a story. So if you've never done that before, I want you to go away and do that now. You can obviously watch the rest of the video if you want, you don't need to pause it right this second, but I want you to go away from this video and actually look at who this Jesus guy is according to the Gospels, and think about it, and think how that aligns with what you believe about him, what you know about him, and start to build that knowledge and understanding. It is just starting as well. It's not going to be you read it once and know everything. I've read the Gospels many times, and each time I read them I learn new things. I understand God better, I understand Jesus better. And I know people who have been Christian far longer than me, bearing in mind I started going to church when I was a kid and have been really taking my faith seriously since I was about 17, 18. But there are people a lot older than me that are still learning about Jesus every time they read the Gospels. So it is just a start, it's not you're going to know everything straight away. And then once you've read it, once you start to picture and formulate and come up with this idea of who Jesus is, then we can move on to the next step of sharing the gospel, which has nothing to do with sharing. At least not telling people or going up to people and talking to them or answering questions. I think the first step to sharing the gospel is to live it. which may sound strange, may sound complicated even, but it's not as hard as you might think. If you have ever read the Gospels or ever really gone to church, there's quite a famous part of the New Testament where Jesus is talking to some Pharisees and they ask him what the greatest law is, or commandment, whichever word you want to use. And Jesus says, the greatest one is to love God with all your mind, heart, soul and strength. But then also the second is to love your neighbour as yourself. So what does that actually mean? Now, it may sound like a challenge to start with, but basically it's treat everyone around you like you want to be treated. I want to be treated with respect, with dignity, like my voice and opinion matters, and I want to know that people care for me and enjoy being around me and things like that. That's probably how most people watching this video also want to be treated. And Jesus is basically saying, treat people like they matter, like you actually value what they're saying, what their opinion is and things like that. No matter whether you agree with them or disagree with them, whether they're completely different to you or whatever, treat people with dignity, rather than perhaps how society treats people. The society is very divided at the moment, whether that's small division built in society about what football club you support. I know as a football fan that there are certain people that support my club, which is Tottenham, that just hate anyone who supports Arsenal. And whether that division also goes large scale, where you just need to look at America. This year there were massive protests and stuff in the summer, and then with the election that's just happened, you could see people fighting. It was us against them mentality. No matter which side you agree with, there was very much a my side against your side. And that's not what Jesus wants. He wants everyone to know they are cared for, they are loved. And he wants us, as Christians, as people that follow Christ and follow his teachings, to show people that. Because if we can't do that, knowing what Jesus has done for us, then who can? We should be showing these people and showing people in our lives that they are loved and cared for. No matter what they've done, no matter what they do, no matter if we agree or disagree, as I said, because that's what Jesus does. And that's what Jesus wants us to do. Now, there have been loads of times in history of Christianity and following that teaching where people are outcast or thrown out of even society or church because of that. The early disciples were thrown out of society, put in exile, some even killed. And then there have been people that have been thrown out of church because they went against what the church was wanting at the time, especially in like the 1500s and stuff like that. There was a guy called Martin Luther who got thrown out of the church because he wanted to teach people about Jesus and the gospel, that Jesus has died for them, and give people access to that knowledge through translating the Bible and stuff like that from Latin. But the church and the leaders at the time didn't want that, so they threw him out. And there have been people since, even in modern history, there have been people that have been thrown out of church or thrown out of society because they want people to know the true meaning of the gospel. And when we live it, like I was saying, it's sharing it. If Martin Luther, if the disciples didn't live the gospel, we wouldn't know God today. We wouldn't have grown as a church. We wouldn't know anything, really. Because if they didn't live it, people wouldn't have believed what they said. and what they shared enough to accept it as truth. They would have just seen it as a crackpot in the field ranting about this God guy or this Jesus guy, but they don't act like it. And that's the important one, is we need to act like we know the gospel. And once we start acting it, people start asking us questions. People start wanting to know why we're different, why we care so much about the people around us, why we want people to have better lives. And once people start seeing that, they'll ask us more important questions as well. Who is this Jesus guy? Why do you follow him? And this is where you start to properly share the gospel, not just through living it, but through actually teaching it. And you may think, oh, I'm not good enough to teach the gospel. I don't know enough about the Bible. I've not gone to college. I'm not at that level. The truth is, it's like I said earlier, you're never going to know enough, essentially. You're never going to be able to answer every question everyone asks you about God. In my job, I get asked questions all the time. I've gone into school for Q&A sessions, and every time there's always one or two questions that I don't know how to answer that. I don't know how to, what the Bible actually says completely on that subject. And that's me after all my training and working as a youth worker. So it's understandable you, as just a friend or schoolmate or colleague, aren't going to be able to answer all the questions. But people don't expect you, at least from my experience, don't expect you to be an encyclopedia. It's okay to say you don't know. In fact, it was one of the best things I learned while at training, was to be able to say, with the ability to say, I don't know, let's look that up. Or I don't know, I'll have to get back to you in a day or two's time with an answer. And that's what I want you guys to learn, is when your friends ask you questions, when your schoolmates ask you questions, you don't need to necessarily answer it there and then. Most of the time, they'll be okay you getting back to them in a little bit, or giving a rough answer if you think you know something, and then getting back to them. But also, one of the most common questions, I want to actually just give you a way of answering it. One of the most common questions I've ever really been asked is, who is Jesus and why do you follow him? And there's a really easy way I've learned to explain this. I want to teach you guys. It's only a couple of sentences, and it's, Jesus is the Son of God that came down to earth. He came down to earth so we could have a relationship with God. He did this through dying on the cross, and as a result, I believe I now have a relationship with God. That's the gospel summed up in a number of, handful of sentences. And once you've summed that up, people start to get a picture, and what they then need is important, which we're going to explain next week. But it's actually not necessarily explaining all the Bible or explaining the whole book of Matthew to them. It's explaining God's relationship to you. That's the next part of sharing the gospel. And we're going to look into that in depth next week. So if you start thinking about, what does God actually mean to me? What's that relationship with me? Do. Go away, think about that so you can have a few ideas for next week's video. And also, like I said, even if you've read them before, I really want you to be challenged this week to try and start reading a gospel, especially in the build up to Christmas. It's not going to be doing Christmas in July or whatever. You can read, start with the Christmas story and go on. So just pick a random one, perhaps one you've not read before, and read that gospel so you can develop your knowledge of Jesus and develop your understanding of who he is. And do that, think of your story and understanding of Jesus, and then also just go away and think, what does Jesus truly mean to me? And if you don't have a massive in-depth answer, that's fine. You don't need to share it with anyone. Just go away and think, what does Jesus mean to me? That's it for this week. It's been a little bit longer because there's not going to be a Zoom session attached to it, I'm afraid. It's just this video this week. So even though it's a bit longer, I hope you learned something, and I hope you've learned how to share the gospel more through knowing it, through living it, and then through starting to answer some questions, but then also what we'll explore next week of how to use and share your story with the gospel to your friends. See you next week.